let's now welcome our speakers and embark on this first session of this journey. So the first question that I would like to pose our speakers is the following. And can each of you tell us what it means to you and in your work to adopt gender-centered and feminist approaches to the history of international law? Yeah, I guess Aoife.
First, Fred, thanks very much for this invitation. It's amazing to be amongst such a great bunch of speakers, but also the entire seminar series looks fantastic. So I'm really looking forward to the whole series of events. So what does having a gender-centered or feminist approach? So I kind of want to focus on what a feminist narrative would mean, and I think narrative is an extremely powerful tool. Because whatever becomes the dominant narrative kind of tends to dominate the discourse and everything that you're kind of bunching against. And in lots of ways, the feminist narrative to me shouldn't do that. So I think partly it's about seeing narrative differently. So yes, centering gender, how it's constructed, how we reflect about who's in the room, who wasn't in the room, how the law was produced, the narratives the law produces. But I think a feminist narrative would also look to the subtleties, perhaps the emotions of an event or a time or a series of events, the silences and the forgetfulness. And some of my work, I talk about radically remembering or radically forgetting. And I think part of that is seeing who are placed in the narratives on the margins and not dismissing that, but seeing what is core, what is peripheral, and what's constructed. So I think a feminist narrative to me and what a feminist character is that it's plural, it's embracing narratives in that same sense, but not as a dominant, not single viewpoint, but kind of multiplicity, that there's kind of a cacophony almost, that it's contingent, that you're aware of who's going to read it and how they will receive what you're writing or speaking or even what I'm saying now. So kind of having that, and sort of thinking, I suppose, in lots of ways, how women and feminists have been writing and saying for centuries, speaking across time to each other and reminding us of the kind of plurality of narratives there. So I suppose that, to me, that I think is what it is to manifest it in the narrative.
Thank you so much. Maria, do you want to add on?
Yeah. Okay, hi everyone, and again, thank you for inviting me, and I'm so glad to meet you all. I'm looking forward to the future seminars. So the first question, I'm gonna make 4 points, and maybe because I am not an international lawyer, so my first question and the first point is there anything special about writing a feminist history of international law, for example, and what's the difference if we were writing a history of private law, of contract law, or of obligations? So I personally, I cannot see the difference, but maybe in the discussion or at some other occasion, we could, I know that international law has made the historical turn that no other discipline of law has made. So I understand that, but in terms of how a feminist history. So the two, my second point is that the first thing I would do in order to write a feminist history of international law or law, it would be to identify what I don't like in this law. What are the points that bother me? What it doesn't fit with me or it doesn't seem right. And once I identify that, then I have obviously to think how I engage with it. And one point I wanted to make is that I will not necessarily, the things I don't like are not necessarily things that promote inequality or so. My starting point, it would not necessarily mean, I'm not saying it cannot be, but it will not necessarily mean that women are excluded or they are not included or whatever other women's or gender issues we identify in all aspects or in all areas of law. And I am saying that because what I'm interested primarily in such a history is to use feminist theory and feminist history, not only of law, but feminist historiography, to analyze the aspect of law I don't like. So the emphasis for me is how we argue about law, what informs the knowledge claims we make about a particular law. So if I was something I would like to fight against is current arguments about international law, how they've been in traditional historical discourse, I can say male or not, or patriarchal or whatever. But so it was more how, for me, it's very important that introduce a feminist theoretical, historical engagement with the problem of international law or law. I mean, I can give examples, I'm not sure. Do I have time, or I mean I can stop? I don't need to.
Next time, yes, I think we should keep this example for the later discussion. Fine. Yeah, great. Diane, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. And let me repeat the congratulations and thanks that others have already said. It's so good to see some old friends and meet some new ones through this process. I'm going to say something that may or may not be controversial, but maybe open some space to think about some things. The question is, you posed it to us, was, what do we think about gender-centered and/or feminist approaches? And I don't think I do gender-centered work, and I'm not. I sort of push back at equations of those two concepts. For me, the joy of doing feminist work is just how pluralistic it is, and how complex and how multiplicitous it is, how many methods can be used, how many sources can be consulted, how many things can be thought about. And I think Maria's intervention just now showed that, right? That part of what we want to do is just pull things apart and see whether what we think of as the dominant or the conventional narratives hold up or not. And so for me, one of the works that I have just published that for me is a feminist history is to look at children who were witnesses at one of the Nuremberg trials. There was nothing in that necessarily that centered their status as girls or boys in the work I was doing, but to talk about them, their nationality, their positionality, the structures of geopolitical power that led to Nuremberg, and to ask different questions and talk about people who aren't in the conventional narrative is, for me, at least one of the many possible feminist approaches.
Thank you so much. And Gina.
Oh, thank you, Paola, and thank you for the invite. Lovely to be here in conversation with colleagues. Of course, Paola, you and I have had these conversations for a long time, and I feel like maybe you should be answering this question. I probably agree with all the things that have been said. I had some notes here about the distinction between fiction and history, which maybe taps into what Aoife was saying about narratives, which narrative is fiction, which is history, and feminist kind of approaches to thinking about the history of international law, perhaps working with literature and fiction, but is that the fiction, or is perhaps the classed, racialized, heteronormative, colonial, ableist gender history the fiction? And so kind of playing with that, which I guess is the story of what Maria says is what we don't like about law, we kind of go in and pick up. But one of the things you and I have always talked about, Paola, and which I think maybe nicely sort of picks up where Diane left off, not just thinking about where the women are or women's histories, but gender as a tool that comes to international law, including our histories. but I think there's an important space where we could be doing more work about thinking the history of feminist encounters in global governance. So if we really want to pick apart the colonial, racialized, heteronormative, ableist and class history that intertwines with gender, I think we have to also be thinking about how, when gender is being co-opted into histories. And for me, that part of gender and feminist histories is so important in terms of how we do it, to really think beyond just finding the gendered moments. Yeah, I'll stop there, but I think it leads into your next question possibly quite nicely.
Yes, absolutely. Great. Yes, and I think it leads the conversation exactly on thinking a little bit more on methods or what we use as tools when we talk about feminist approaches to the history of international law, which seems from your different replies, something that shared from all of you is exactly this pluralistic tool of conducting legal critique. So the next question is precisely whether you could tell us more about the ways in which you think that feminist viewpoints can expand our understanding of history writing and its methods, or how can they expand it, or what are their limitations, what are the potential critiques of adopting these feminist methods? Yes. So do you want to pick up from there, Gina?
Oh, so it comes straight back to me. So that wasn't very good planning, but never mind. So shall I start with limitations? I wonder about, when we turn to history, what are the risks of finding what we're looking for? You know, if we kind of assume women's absence, then we find that because we're looking for it. And how do we kind of unpick that a little bit more and kind of go to both a kind of, and maybe this hints to what I was saying before, that we also need to think about the history of feminisms within international law and how their feminism has been co-opted into different spaces, not all feminisms. And so maybe to avoid a limitation like that, we need to think outside of where we expect to find legal encounters, histories of feminist protest and feminist resistance, which may have an impact or may not have an impact, may be silenced by law, and asking different kinds of questions. So I think there's a potential there for feminist work and methods to transform the way we think about our histories of international law. But there is also this risk or a limitation that on the one hand, maybe we'll find what we're looking for, or we reproduce some of the tropes that are already within the discipline by bringing women in as outsiders and always pitched as outside. So perhaps thinking through those kinds of trajectories. Onto, I don't know who's next. Maybe Diane.
Sure. So I think sometimes of doing feminist histories in particular, and certainly in the area of international law, as almost opening the book at a different page, or entering the story at a different place, right? And so the work that I'm doing on women professionals at the first Nuremberg trial, it's not open to me, as it is to many of the perhaps too many people that have done histories of that first Nuremberg trial. It's not open to me to work with the official record as my primary source because the women aren't mentioned. Or if they're mentioned, they are dropped in a footnote that says, we'd like to thank these 10 people for assisting on these briefs. But they don't tell us if they were the typist, the janitor, or the person who actually did the research and writing. And so at best, we sort of just get a breadcrumb from that. And so that forces an historian that's thinking about entering at a different point, that's trying to do what's sometimes called history from below, is to look for other sources. Are there, did they write anywhere else? Do we find other places where we can see what their lives might have been like? Can we open our imagination to figure out what's not being said? For me, that's meant a lot of archival work. it's meant a lot of excavation, in part, if you are searching for women, particularly, well, even today, but certainly in this period, um, women even today tend to change their surnames back and forth as they marry, divorce, etc. And that makes them harder to track over their lifetimes than most men who almost never change their surname. And so it's much more of a detective work, much more of an imagination, much more asking questions. So one of the things Gina said about privilege and different feminisms and who was co-opted, who was included, I think every time we look at stories about, say, a woman who was a delegate at the first UN conference or something like that, we probably need to ask who dressed her. How did she get there? What were the educational opportunities that she had that put her in the room? Some of them may seem a bit unpalatable, right? How did she treat her servant? But others, at the same time, even the most privileged women, I think, will find in those circumstances themselves had challenges that their male counterparts didn't. So trying to really play with that mess of questions, I think, is part of what interests me and I find very useful about this set of methodologies. Oh, Maria.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I mean, the way I want to approach this question is a little bit, you have some sub-questions about context history and objective history. I mean, I do think, I don't believe in objective history. I don't believe in a singular narrative. I don't believe so much in contextual history, which I think, from what I understand, is very prominent in histories, not feminist histories, but histories of, and the reason I say I'm not particularly, because I'm more interested in the question, what are the possibilities of this context, how this context through which we interpret. So that is one way I would think. So my work, and I think if I was doing work in international law, it would be more influenced by historians like Tomlins and more like the Foucauldian type, which ask questions about what are the conditions of the possibility of the problem. So, for example, and I really think this is a good way of talking about some of the issues that Gina and Diane raised about, for example, the participation of women in colonial governance, which is a topic dear to my heart, and I'm working at it now, actually. So I think we need to understand what made possible for these women to participate. They were not, starting that they were upper class or they were privileged women and therefore, allied with a male colonial administration. I don't think, for me, is a good justification. And also, I think if we ask questions, what made this possible, why these women did behaved or conduct themselves in this way, we emphasize some of the things you say later on the so self-reflection, reflection, understanding ourselves as feminists, how we conduct, why we conduct ourselves in particular ways. So in writing a history of international law, I would not do work by trying to understand, because I think contextual approaches to history create a very sharp division between past and present, in the sense that the past is what it is, and we could separate it and make it an object of historical inquiry. And in this way, we kind of distance ourselves from it as the bad past that also the present again could be seen as in a kind of evolutionary progressive way. We are much better now than perhaps the past. So I think these are dangers and limitations of the contextual approach, which I think a more post-structural approach can, I mean, we can talk more in the discussion. There is no time to develop this more, but that would be my personal choice. Thank you.
So I'll carry on from there. Actually, it's quite useful kind of jumping off spot for what I wanted to say about it. So, I mean, when there was a point when I decided I was going to go off and read about feminist historical approaches within history as a discipline, because I thought that might help in some ways, because for me, from a methods perspective, the dominance of the contextual approach in international law, and I found it quite suffocating that unless that was the only way you were doing real law. And I don't mean that as shade about sort of the Cambridge School or anything, but I thought it might be useful. So I read a lot of Joan Wallach-Scott, who's an amazing feminist historian. She has a great book, The Fantasy of Feminist History, which is amazing. And she's a real pioneer. And I think one of the things I also did was I went and had a chat with some historians, and I asked, if you had a room of 100 historians, how many of them would do the contextual Cambridge School? And again, this is not shaded at that. It's brought a huge amount of very useful stuff to international law. And I'm not into sort of like the hierarchies of what's better and what's worse. But the friends at home, if you had a room for 100 people, you might have like 5 in the room. But in international legal history conferences, or you're in a panel, everyone in the room must be doing this or nothing else. And I found that approach, that to me was problematic, not the actual methodology, but the way that it came to dominate, and that everything else that everybody else was doing was wrong or faulty, when that's not true in history. So I'm not sure why it should be true in international legal history, even though, as Diane has said and Maria said, it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. They aren't the same approach. But for me, that was quite useful. And I think there's a tension there between doing history and I think doing international legal history of law traveling across time in a way that maybe feminist histories do as well, that lends itself to feminist discussions across time in a way that history in contextual approach doesn't. But I think international legal history, because law travels across time and through time, and we can be talking about laws that were made in the 1500s and talking about them now, it travels across time. So I think it's quite useful to think of law. And on the point about ideology, when I'm doing international history, for me, it's important. There is no objective, and this has been said, there is no ideology-free history. There is no advocacy-free history. Law is political, and all contexts are constructed. So even if you were purely doing the Cambridge method, you are constructing a context, and there were other contexts that could have been constructed. And again, to think about that idea of the public and public international law, and like Karen Knopp is doing amazing work on the public-private divide in international law. But I think for me, it's a question for international legal history if you're doing it from a feminist perspective, especially I think what Diane was saying about how you find the women who were there and their surnames and what they were doing and their role, and it's so hard to find. But it's a very strange thing because we write about the discipline all the time and the great heroes and the great writers. And they're all working in jobs, right? And they are working theoretically in universities in this sort of more private sphere, but we never talk about it like that. They get adopted into the public sphere with a free pass. But we have to always sort of, as we're doing feminist histories and we're doing the great work that Diane's doing, that there's somehow there that you have to sort of explain yourself more when we do that all the time with the men. But it's just sort of, it's natural. It's that's objective and ideology free. But when we do it, it's very feminist. So I'll move on to the next question.
Well, yes, exactly. This leads us really to the next question, which is precisely about, beliefs and goals. So I guess related about this question, and sometimes critiques of what is a feminist ideology. So the next question is, could you tell us whether, and if so, how, feminist values and perspective, let's call it as such, enhance and transform approaches, both in historical research, but also in theory and in feminist studies, so what we call feminist. Shall we go the other way around now and maybe start with Gina?
Didn't I start last time? Sure.
Right,
I'm back again. Okay, I was expecting to go last. That's fine. Well, actually, I mean, I think it's impossible for like feminist values or I guess more normative commitments to things like intersectionality, inclusivity, reflexiveness, positionality, anti-colonialism, social justice, resistance, pacifism, to use your old questions and things. I think it's impossible not to bring them in, but the risk, I guess, is that you end up with a feminist history project that doesn't look like an international legal project anymore. And there's a kind of tension between a kind of commitment to those values and I guess specifically the historical research component. It doesn't bother me, but I think, you know, it also depends where you are in your career. You probably have to write something more that looks a little bit more like an international legal history and suddenly meet some commitments to your feminist agenda or feminist methods, as well as your commitments to writing into a discipline that you perhaps want to disrupt. I guess that's there for many feminist projects as well. And I'm just thinking about like tools that are kind of useful around that. Something we haven't mentioned, although I think Diane talked about bottom-up projects, is the nexus between the local and the global that I think is important in international legal histories. And I'll put this in the chat. It always makes me think of Annalise Ryle's amazing piece on the view from the international plane, although I haven't got the full reference, but I'll put enough keywords in, where she talks about like what gets hoisted up into the international and what stays in the local. And if we think of kind of gendered conceptions of citizenship and sexuality, for example, sometimes these things are in the international and more often they're left to be local problems. And Annalise Ryle's really asks about how that happens. But I think feminist history work is also committed to, you know, undoing like what stays local because it's gendered, for example. But I think also it does create a tension in the project, and probably Aoife will say much more about that. And I think it's a pity we haven't got Imi here, because I think that her book on the Portrait Gallery of International Law has really done some great work in holding those values, but kind of intervening into the mainstream at the same time.
Thank you.
Back to Diane.
Diane, yeah.
Sure. Is there a way to stop that ringing every time someone does chat? I'm finding it really hard to catch to keep my concentration. I'm getting a bell every time someone does a chat bubble. But in answer to the question, so maybe one thing to ask is, why is this not just cultural history? How is this something other than critical history? And you know, I was in graduate school a long time ago, and we were talking about the fact that value neutral was a falsehood, that there was no such thing as value neutral. Non-ideological, I think, was Aoife's terminology. Ways of describing things. And so those kinds of critiques were out there. I think the difference is that, and now I'm going to reverse what I said before, they were being put forward by men. And they were often done within a patriarchal, hegemonic sort of way. Who gets to say these things? Who gets to ask these questions? Who gets to pronounce the answers? Women weren't actually part of that discussion. So maybe part of calling it a feminist set of methodologies instead of simply a critical set of methodologies is that there is a commitment to women, and in one iteration of what I've been doing lately, I've been referring to women and others, right? That it's those who are not always at the podium getting to talk. As for sort of how do we incorporate the values, what sort of techniques, the one thing that I would say I think is really important, at least for me, is to do archival work, to actually read the writings of folks at the time rather than sort of secondary literature, which sort of imagines what it was, and be willing to grapple with what it says, where it gets you. One work that I'd like to flag is the work of Kalyani Ramnath, who sadly just left Georgia for Columbia. Our loss, their gain. She is both an historian and a lawyer, and she's done some amazing work using the Indian Ocean as an area that has many nationalities around the rim of it, talking about the movement of peoples immediately, well, during and after World War II, because the way that the Japanese advanced created waves and waves of displacement of many different people of different nationalities. And her source material is old property records that she acquired by sitting in sort of a moldy room in India where these things were sort of falling off the shelves. And the stories that she tells and the people she's able to track and their experiences is really fantastic. And it is a legal story because these are legal property records, right? That and there's issues of who gets citizenship, who doesn't, in all of this movement. So I think there are ways that we can commit to maybe doing research differently when we're forced to look beyond what's been the conventional record. Oh, let's try Aoife this time.
I think it's such a big question. For me, I think it's important to not think of doing feminist histories, if we're thinking about how it enhances and transforms, is not to do it in a siloed way. Because for me, there's always an element of history going on, and no matter what I'm doing. So, I did a lot of Brexit work for the last, as long as it's been going on, it's nearly a decade now. But and I was on Northern Ireland, but in order to do that, you had to understand what was going on in Northern Ireland, historically, contextually, why it was necessary to keep those rights. So in doing that, like doing that Brexit work, while that isn't obvious feminist historical work, for me, it absolutely was, that you had to do it. You had to be using feminist methods in doing that kind of work. And even just the basic questions about like asking the women question, like that very basic, you're reading a text and you think to yourself, because I think taking that lead can be quite an imperative, because other questions naturally flow from that. So the queer question, the colonial question, racialized aspects of what you're reading or writing. So for me, it enhances every aspect. And I think law is full of binaries. And a very basic feminist theoretical approach, right, is to deconstruct binaries. So I think it's a very easy way to just be doing it all the time, right? To be looking at, is there a binary here? How is that binary constructed? How is it presenting an inevitable choice between chaos and order? And how is that constructed in a way? And even just asking that binary question isn't necessarily asking, Diane was saying about gender necessarily, but it is using feminist methods to break down other aspects of the history as you go along. So it's kind of a set of practices that acknowledge all the, the binaries that are going on, asking, the woman question, asking the colonial question in international law particularly. But also I think it can enhance it, because if you're doing international history through a feminist approach, you can't claim to be telling a universal story or to even be telling a whole story. That you can't do that if you are doing a feminist method. So many things that you read in international legal history claim to do that. Like they claim to be telling the story of a particular moment. And I think if you use it, enhances your ability to avoid doing that if you're thinking through feminist methods. And I always like to bring in a bit of pop culture in when I'm answering a question. So one of the songs that I like to refer to is the Indigo Girls, who are a great feminist queer band. And in one of the choruses, one of their most famous song probably, they say, "And the less I seek my source for some definitive, the closer I am to find." And I think that is a real kind of a way of guiding yourself through feminist history, is that you're not looking for the definitive, you're not looking for the universal story, you're not looking for the absolute story. And from there, you will move towards inclusivity, you will move towards intersectionality, because you aren't seeking that definitive. And I think from that, I would say, and it's a much smaller point that I'll finish on, is also doing it in a way that is open to everybody. I mean, we've all been in rooms when somebody starts talking about Foucault or Pufendorf or Fanon, when it becomes entirely exclusionary. So you look back what Diane was saying about, like, when the men were saying it, and it becomes so that you have this knowledge and nobody else does. And I think being a feminist scholar more generally, but in feminist legal history, is not doing that, like not employing the Latin, explaining your sources and where you got things, acknowledging who you've been reading, as we've all naturally been doing anyway. But I thought I'll pass over to Maria.
Okay. It is indeed a very difficult question and a very open question, I think for me the first problem is feminist values. Is there such a thing as universally talking? I mean, even within the West, let alone feminist values. I mean, even, for example, the Australian feminists have a different tradition within which they operate from the English feminists, even if the legal system is the same, even if internationally they are allies in many issues. So it is different, the critical task of Australian feminism, let's say, from English feminism, even if they are both involved in the empire. There are different ways in which. So I find that very difficult to engage with. However, I think some of the examples that they were mentioned can show a sensitivity, a feminist sensitivity, an acknowledgement and critical acknowledgement of the role, let's say, Western feminists have played. And there is a trend in historiography rather than feminist legal historiography, for example, not anymore to explore the history of the empire separately from the history of the empire, imperial subjects. So Ann Stoller has written quite a fair bit about that, and I think that shows a certain sensitivity, a certain acknowledgement of the different ways and the different burdens we have and the different questions we have to answer. But, so I'm not sure I'm answering that question very well, but I find it quite challenging. Also, I was not clear about, you say, in what ways does inclusivity shape the evolution of feminist theories? I'm not sure I understand that, and what would be that evolution of feminist theory, where we want to go. I mean, evolution is a difficult word. It's a difficult word because it implies a progress, it implies that we are here and we can go there. I think some of for me, and from my work, if we look back at the history of women, not in terms of law, but like 17, there was a lot of tendency for women, especially in educational settings, to work and talk. There are feminists who wrote about feminist communities and how they outside, they create a different environment. And I think for me, the only thing that is important is to be open, to listen to each other, and to create a feminist academic community, legal community, if you want, that will actually work around these questions. I don't have an answer other than I think it would be nice to work with other women. Yeah.
Great. I think this was maybe more than an answer, because it's more food for thought than just a simply yes or no answer. So thank you so much, everybody, actually, for your thoughts and for this really inspiring discussion.